It was supposed to be a simple late-night drive home, the kind of routine journey thousands of couples make every day. They had left a friends' gathering earlier than most, choosing to take the quieter highway that threaded through farmland and patches of forest, rather than the interstate. It was a route they knew well, a road that at night was usually empty except for the occasional trucker. For them, it was supposed to be uneventful. But that night, the silence of the highway would become the last place they were ever seen alive. At around 11:45, a passing driver later told investigators he noticed a small sedan parked on the shoulder, with its hazard lights blinking. At first glance, nothing appeared strange. Cars break down, people stop to rest, accidents happen. The witness slowed, looked at the vehicle as he drove past, and saw no one standing outside, no frantic waving, no sign of distress. Just the glow of amber lights blinking against the darkness. It didn't seem urgent enough to stop. He kept driving. When dawn came, the sedan was still there. This time it was another driver who spotted it, the same hazard lights still pulsing, the same lonely position on the shoulder. Unlike the night before, daylight revealed more. Both front doors were unlocked, the car appeared undamaged, and the driver and passenger were nowhere to be found. It looked as if the couple had stepped away for just a moment and never returned. Police were called to the scene just after sunrise. The vehicle was registered to the couple, a young man and woman in their late 20s who lived less than an hour away. Inside, their wallets, driver's licenses, and personal belongings were all accounted for. The car's keys were still in the ignition. Investigators noted no broken windows, no forced entry, and no sign of a violent struggle in or around the vehicle. The ground nearby showed tire tracks from other vehicles, but that was normal for a highway shoulder. There were no footprints leading away, no discarded clothing, no blood, no indication of where they could have gone. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. Officers widened the search, scanning the ditches and brush near the roadside, fearing perhaps they had wandered off and collapsed. Nothing turned up. Deputies considered whether the car had experienced mechanical failure, but the battery, fuel, and tires were all intact. The engine started without issue. The hazards had been intentionally switched on, but for what reason, no one could say. Word of the abandoned car spread quickly through the small town nearby. Friends and relatives were contacted and confirmed the couple had been together that evening at a gathering, leaving around 11. No arguments, no strange behavior, nothing to suggest they planned to disappear. They were described as responsible, steady, deeply connected to family. The idea that they would abandon their vehicle on a highway and walk away into the night was unthinkable. As hours turned into the first long day of searching, deputies brought in dogs to canvass the roadside. The animals picked up a faint scent near the car, but lost it just a short distance into the surrounding woods, as though whatever trail existed had been swallowed by the night. Helicopters scanned from above, their searchlights sweeping through tree canopies, but saw no sign of movement. The highway, usually so quiet, now became a focal point of confusion and fear. Truckers were interviewed at nearby rest stops, but none recalled seeing the couple walking, hitchhiking, or signaling for help. No tow services were called. No hospitals had intake records of unidentified crash victims. Every possibility investigators turned to seem to dead end within hours. By evening, the couple's parents arrived at the highway shoulder, staring at the car as if proximity might force an answer. For them, it was unthinkable that their children could disappear in such an ordinary place. The mother pressed her hand against the driver's window, the glass cold to the touch, and whispered their names as though expecting them to return. But the emptiness inside the car only deepened the silence. Reporters began circling the case almost immediately. A young couple, missing without a trace, a car left behind in perfect condition. It had the ingredients of a mystery that unsettled even the most skeptical minds. For detectives, it was the beginning of a nightmare, the kind of case where every logical explanation crumbles under scrutiny. Some speculated the pair had argued and walked off into the woods, though their families dismissed the idea as absurd. Others suggested a crime of opportunity, that a stranger had stopped, lured them away, and left no evidence behind. The absence of footprints, the lack of any sign of struggle, made that theory as troubling as it was plausible. But no matter how many scenarios were suggested, the fact remained the same. Two people had vanished from a car that was still waiting patiently on the shoulder of a lonely highway. As the sun set on that first day, officers impounded the sedan, hoping forensic processing would provide clues overlooked at the scene. For the families, the absence of answers in those crucial early hours was crushing. They clung to the hope that perhaps their loved ones had been taken against their will, but were still alive somewhere. But the uncertainty gnawed at everyone who looked at the blinking hazard lights and asked the same unanswerable question: where had they gone, and why? The case had barely begun, but already investigators knew this was not going to be a routine search and rescue. This was something darker, stranger, and far more unsettling. A simple roadside stop had turned into a disappearance that defied logic. And as the days ahead would prove, what looked like an ordinary stretch of highway was about to reveal secrets far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. When the news reached their families that the car had been found abandoned, disbelief turned instantly into fear. A broken-down vehicle on a quiet highway could mean a flat tire, maybe a dead battery. But when hours passed with no phone calls and no sign of them returning home, the dread became impossible to ignore. Parents and siblings tried calling their cell phones again and again, but each attempt went straight to voicemail. The silence on the other end was suffocating. Within the first 12 hours, relatives began piecing together the timeline. They had left a gathering around 11, cheerful and tired, but otherwise normal. They were supposed to drive less than an hour, yet by morning their car was still parked on the shoulder, the hazard lights draining the battery in a steady pulse. Panic began to build, and with it came a flood of desperate theories. Had they been in an accident? Could they have fallen into a ravine or river? The thought that they might be injured somewhere nearby but unseen was unbearable. Police, now treating the case as an urgent disappearance, began a systematic search. Officers scoured both sides of the highway, moving slowly through ditches and underbrush. The terrain was uneven, but not impassable, and searchers expected at any moment to stumble across some clue: a shoe, a discarded bag, even one of the missing themselves. But each sweep of the area ended in frustration. There was nothing. The first major effort came at the river less than a mile from where the car had been found. If they had wandered away from the vehicle in confusion, perhaps under the influence of shock or injury, they might have reached the water. Boats were deployed and divers combed the depths, pulling through silt and weeds in hopes of finding a body or even clothing. Hours stretched into an entire day, and still the river yielded nothing. The water remained cold and indifferent, giving back no answers. At the same time, canine units were brought in. Dogs sniffed articles of clothing taken from the couple's home, then circled the roadside. For a brief moment, handlers believed the animals caught a trace, pulling toward a path leading into the woods. But the trail faded within minutes, the scent dissolving into nothing as though the pair had vanished into the night air itself. Handlers tried again, releasing the dogs at different points, but each attempt ended the same way, with the animals pacing, confused, unable to push farther than a few dozen yards. Detectives shifted focus toward the human element. They interviewed truck drivers who had traveled that highway overnight, hoping someone had seen the couple walking, waving for help, or climbing into another vehicle. Some drivers vaguely recalled seeing hazard lights in the distance, but no one had stopped, and no one reported seeing two people standing outside. One trucker said he thought he glimpsed movement near the car, but he admitted it could have been shadows cast by his own headlights. The accounts were frustratingly inconsistent, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. Meanwhile, families clung to the hope that perhaps the couple had suffered a minor mishap and would be found quickly. But hope dimmed when police returned from the impound lot with a chilling detail. Both wallets, identification cards, and personal belongings were still inside the vehicle. The car had not been ransacked, nothing of value appeared missing, and the ignition key was still resting where it had been left. This was not a case of robbery or theft. It was as though the couple had deliberately stepped away from everything they owned and simply never returned. The absence of logical explanation began to gnaw at everyone involved. Investigators considered the possibility of abduction, but with no signs of a struggle and no reports of suspicious vehicles in the area, the theory seemed both possible and impossible all at once. Families wondered if perhaps they had left willingly, but this was quickly dismissed by those who knew them best. They were not the kind of people to vanish voluntarily, especially without contacting loved ones. As the second night fell, the highway shoulder where the car had been found became a grim vigil. Relatives gathered with flashlights, calling their names into the woods, hoping to hear even the faintest reply. Neighbors and volunteers joined in, their lights flickering like fireflies in the dark, but the only response was silence. Every hour that passed without discovery made survival less likely. The dread was no longer about whether something had happened, but about what form that something had taken. Media outlets picked up the story, amplifying the strangeness of the case. Headlines described a healthy young couple who had simply vanished in the span of a few minutes. Reporters described it as a real-life ghost story, but for those closest to the missing, it was no story. It was torment. Parents sat by their phones, praying for a call that never came. Detectives reviewed every inch of evidence they had, which amounted to a car on a shoulder, hazard lights still blinking, and 2 lives cut out of their own timeline. By the end of those first critical hours, panic had hardened into something more complicated, a mixture of exhaustion, suspicion, and the sickening sense that this was not going to end quickly. Detectives looked at the empty highway, the silent woods, and the river that had yielded no bodies, and they began to realize they weren't just searching for missing persons. They were standing at the edge of something darker, something that couldn't be explained by accidents or wanderings. The first hours had been consumed by panic and desperate hope. What came next would be suspicion, rumor, and the growing fear that the answers lay far deeper than anyone wanted to admit. The first weeks after the disappearance were a blur of restless searches, late-night phone, calls, and a community unable to stop speculating. With no bodies, no wreckage, and no trail to follow, imagination filled the void. Some insisted it had to be a carjacking, though police quickly countered that the car itself had been left behind. Others whispered about dangerous drifters and transient camps that were known to appear in the woods near the highway. The more time passed without answers, the more the story transformed into something larger than the facts themselves. Detectives were buried under tips, each one demanding attention. A truck driver claimed he had seen the couple climbing into another vehicle at a rest stop 2 hours away, but security footage revealed nothing. A woman in a neighboring county swore she had seen 2 people resembling the missing walking along a rural road at dawn, yet deputies who canvassed the area turned up nothing. A farmer even reported finding scraps of clothing near his property that he believed matched the missing woman's blouse, but laboratory testing later proved it belonged to someone else entirely. Each lead raised hopes for a moment and then collapsed, leaving behind only disappointment. Rumors of a suspicious hitchhiker began to surface. Multiple residents mentioned a tall man who had been seen walking along the highway in the weeks before the disappearance, sometimes asking for rides, sometimes simply loitering near gas stations. His description varied from witness to witness. Some said he carried a backpack, others swore he had a limp, but no one could pin down his identity. Detectives tried to track him, checking shelters and running descriptions through police bulletins, but he seemed to vanish as easily as the couple had. Whether he was a dangerous stranger or just another traveler passing through was never determined. For the families, the rumors were agony. Every phone call from detectives, every knock on the door brought a spike of adrenaline, followed by crushing deflation when the lead proved false. The couple's parents made repeated trips to the roadside where the car had been found, laying flowers on the gravel shoulder and sitting in silence. For them, it was not just a random spot on the highway. It had become the last place on earth their children had been alive, the final trace of their existence. They sat there for hours, staring at the trees, convinced the truth lingered close by, even if they couldn't see it. The community's theories began to fracture further. Some believed the couple had staged their disappearance, citing the unlocked car doors as evidence of a quick exit. Others argued it had to be foul play, pointing to the untouched wallets as proof that robbery had never been the motive. A few clung to more outlandish ideas, speaking of old legends about the woods, about travelers who vanished without explanation, swallowed by something no one could name. Though police dismissed such talk, it spread quickly in hushed conversations, feeding an atmosphere already steeped in fear. Investigators doubled down on their efforts, re-interviewing witnesses from the night of the disappearance. The driver who had first seen the hazards blinking recalled nothing unusual beyond the lights themselves. The second motorist, who stopped the following morning, could only describe the eerie stillness of the unlocked car. Neither account gave detectives anything to move forward with. The absence of clear evidence became its own cruel detail, taunting investigators with the possibility that the truth had been there all along, just beyond their reach. The search stretched into new territories. Officers checked bus stations, airports, and rental car records in case the couple had left willingly. Nothing matched. Detectives canvassed hospitals in multiple states, hoping they had been admitted under false names. Again, nothing. They even considered whether the couple had been victims of a serial offender, comparing details to cases in other jurisdictions. Yet each comparison broke down under scrutiny, the patterns failing to align. Weeks dragged into months. Posters with the couple's photographs were stapled to telephone poles, their faces becoming as familiar as the town's own landmarks. Volunteers walked the wooded areas again and again, sometimes with trained dogs, sometimes on their own, but no one found so much as a footprint. As the seasons began to change, hope started to wither. What had begun with frantic urgency now gave way to the dull ache of waiting. For the families, the waiting was unbearable. The parents of both victims formed a habit of meeting at the roadside shoulder, sometimes together, sometimes separately. They brought folding chairs, sat in the tall grass, and watched cars speed past. They imagined every possibility, from their children being held captive somewhere to lying just out of sight beneath the soil nearby. The belief that they had not made it far from that stretch of road became an obsession. It felt impossible that two lives could disappear so completely without leaving even a trace. Detectives shared that sense of disbelief. In private, some admitted they had never seen a case with so little to hold on to. It was as though the night had simply opened up and swallowed the couple whole. Every false lead made the truth feel more elusive, more buried, more deliberately hidden. For investigators, the fear was no longer just about finding the missing. It was about whether the answers had been buried too deep to ever resurface. By the third month, the once frantic search slowed to a crawl. Resources were pulled back, volunteers returned to their routines, and even the media began to lose interest. What remained was silence, a silence broken only by rumors that refused to die, and by grieving parents who refused to stop watching the highway where it had all begun. They were convinced the answers were still there, hidden somewhere in the shadows of that roadside stop, waiting to be uncovered. What they didn't know was that the truth would stay buried for more than 2 decades before the land itself finally revealed what it had been hiding. As the months dragged on with no progress, detectives found themselves circling the same handful of facts again and again. The car had been left on the shoulder, hazards blinking. The belongings had been left untouched. There were no footprints, no witnesses, and no bodies. With nothing new emerging in the present, some investigators turned their attention backward, searching for answers in the history of the highway itself. What they found was unsettling. Records from decades earlier revealed a troubling pattern. This stretch of road, quiet and isolated, had been linked to other disappearances long before the young couple vanished. In the late 1970s, a man traveling home from work had been reported missing. His truck later discovered abandoned only a few miles from where the couple's car was found. He was never seen again. In the early 1980s, a family on a road trip reported seeing a vehicle pulled over with its doors open, but by the time state troopers responded, the car was empty. The owner was eventually classified as a missing person, his case unresolved to this day. Local newspapers archived on microfilm described other incidents too. Women who had been reported as last seen traveling this highway, vehicles found idling on the shoulder, and an eerie string of unsolved missing person reports that never gained wide attention beyond the county line. Each case on its own seemed tragic but isolated. Placed together, they formed a troubling lineage, a shadow history that hinted this was not just an ordinary road. The discoveries were disturbing enough to prompt detectives to bring the information to the families. For them, it was devastating to learn that their children's disappearance might be only the latest chapter in a story decades old. The parents wanted to know why this history hadn't been common knowledge, why no one had ever warned travelers that the road carried such a reputation. Detectives had no good answer, only the uncomfortable realization that many of the old cases had simply faded into obscurity, unsolved, and largely forgotten. As these historical details emerged, whispers in the community began to intensify. Old-timers remembered stories told around kitchen tables, tales of travelers who vanished along that very route. Some recalled a particularly grim local legend about the well in the woods. It was said to be a deep abandoned shaft from the days when farming dominated the area, hidden away after land changed hands and properties were left to rot. According to rumor, it had been a place where unwanted things were thrown, trash, animals, maybe worse. The story of the well had lingered in the background for years, a piece of folklore dismissed as superstition. But as people connected it with the ongoing disappearance, it began to take on new weight. Locals described it as a dark hole surrounded by overgrowth, impossible to spot unless you already knew where to look. Some said teenagers had dared each other to go near it in the 1960s and 70s, always returning shaken by its depth. Others insisted it had been sealed long ago, though no one could say exactly when or by whom. Detectives listened to these accounts but found themselves skeptical. The well, if it existed, was never documented in official land surveys. No coordinates appeared on maps. Without clear evidence, investigators chalked it up to another distraction, one of many myths that inevitably surfaced when fear gripped a small community. Still, the idea lingered, impossible to completely shake. What unsettled investigators most was how neatly the legend overlapped with the history of vanishings on the highway. Each unsolved disappearance seemed to reinforce the idea that something was hidden in those woods, something no one had yet uncovered. Yet, with no physical proof, it remained nothing more than a story, and stories were not evidence. For the families, the resurfacing of the legend only deepened their torment. They had clung to the hope that their children might still be alive, somewhere far away. But the idea of a hidden well, a place where bodies could disappear forever, haunted their thoughts. It was easier to believe in carjackings or kidnappings, even unlikely ones, than to accept the possibility that their loved ones might be lying at the bottom of a forgotten pit, beyond reach or rescue. Detectives tried to temper expectations. They reminded the public that without physical leads, chasing folklore risked pulling resources away from tangible investigation. They pointed out that abandoned farm wells dotted the countryside, most long since collapsed or filled. The chance that one specific shaft had been involved seemed remote. And yet, the persistence of the legend, repeated by so many unrelated sources, was difficult to dismiss entirely. As the first anniversary of the couple's disappearance approached, the investigation had reached a stalemate. The trail was cold, the evidence thin, and the only new information came from the past, a past that painted the highway as a place where people simply disappeared. Detectives admitted privately that they were running out of rational explanations. In official statements, they continued to ask for tips, urging the public to remain vigilant, but the momentum of the search had slowed to a crawl. The parents, however, refused to stop. They drove the highway endlessly, memorizing every turnoff, every tree line, every dip in the terrain. They knocked on doors of homes near the woods, asking if anyone remembered hearing strange noises that night. They pleaded with landowners to let them walk the fields. Again and again, they asked about the well. But each time they reached a dead end, met with shrugs, vague recollections, or polite refusals. The truth was still hidden, buried somewhere between documented history and whispered legend. And though police dismissed the stories, those who spent time on that highway after dark couldn't shake the feeling that the road itself carried secrets, secrets that had swallowed travelers before and might do so again. What no one realized then was that the legend of the well was not just an echo of old fear. It was real. It existed, waiting silently in the woods, its mouth sealed beneath earth and debris. And in time, it would prove to be the place where the mystery of the missing couple and of others before them would finally be solved. As the years crept forward, the absence of answers became its own kind of punishment. What had begun with frantic searches and sleepless nights slowly hardened into a permanent state of waiting, the kind of waiting that gnaws away at families in ways nothing else can. The parents, who once drove the highway daily, hoping for any sign of their children, grew older with each passing year, their faces etched with the exhaustion of carrying a mystery too heavy to set down. They had gone from praying for a rescue to quietly asking themselves if their children were even alive, though neither could bring themselves to say it aloud. Anniversaries became the cruelest markers of time. In the first year, news crews gathered near the roadside where the car had been found. Cameras captured the family's clutching photographs, pleading with the public for information. Detectives gave interviews filled with carefully worded reassurances that the investigation was active, though privately they admitted progress was stagnant. Each anniversary after that became a grim ritual. Reporters would return, faces would be filmed, and the story would be repackaged as another unsolved mystery. When the cameras left, the families returned to their quiet homes, still carrying the silence that lingered long after the reporters were gone. The case file grew thicker with paper, but not with answers. Every few years, detectives rotated out and new investigators inherited the mystery, each promising a fresh perspective. Yet, each found the same thing: a car abandoned, a timeline that ended abruptly, and no leads that held weight. Families learned not to put too much hope into promises of breakthroughs, because time and again those promises collapsed under the same stubborn emptiness. The emotional toll fractured the families in different ways. Some clung desperately to hope, keeping bedrooms untouched, possessions preserved, as though their children might walk back through the door at any moment. Others grew bitter, turning their frustration toward law enforcement, accusing them of incompetence or neglect. Siblings who once shared a bond now argued over how to keep the memory alive, one insisting on yearly vigils, another refusing to participate, tired of reopening wounds that never healed. As decades passed, the parents' health began to falter. Gray hair and deep lines marked their faces, but it was the heaviness in their voices that revealed the weight they carried. Friends noticed how conversations always circled back to the disappearance, as if their lives had become permanently stuck in the year it happened. They attended weddings, funerals, and birthdays of relatives, yet every family gathering was haunted by the empty chairs that should have been filled. For the siblings, the missing couple became both a source of grief and a shadow over their own lives. Some married and had children, always imagining how their brother or sister would have reacted to the milestones they never lived to see. Others pulled away from family altogether, unable to stand the constant reminder that the mystery was still unsolved. Each chose a different way to cope, but none found peace. Every so often, rumors resurfaced. A tip would come in from someone claiming to have seen the missing in another state. A psychic would offer their services, insisting the couple was buried near water. Each time, the families faced a painful dilemma: believe and risk the heartbreak of another dead end, or ignore and risk missing the one true lead. Hope and despair became two sides of the same coin, flipped endlessly but never landing on certainty. By the second decade, the case was still officially open but inactive. Detectives admitted in interviews that without new evidence, there was little more they could do. The families were told the truth in quiet conversations. The file would remain on record, but unless a body surfaced, the likelihood of closure was slim. For parents, hearing those words was like a second loss, a quiet acknowledgement that the system had nothing left to give them. Yet the disappearance refused to fade completely. Each anniversary drew at least a small mention in local papers, often accompanied by black and white photographs of smiling faces frozen in time. For the community, it had become a haunting reminder of fragility, how two people could vanish in an instant, leaving behind nothing but questions. For the families, those reminders were both comforting and agonizing. It meant their loved ones had not been entirely forgotten, but it also meant their absence was permanent enough to be historic. The grief did not soften with age. It calcified. Parents sat in living rooms surrounded by photo albums, their gaze lingering on the same images they had stared at for decades. Brothers and sisters grew weary of repeating the same story to their own children who asked what had happened to their aunt or uncle. No one could answer because the truth was still hidden. What remained was a void, and within that void, endless imagining of possibilities too painful to speak. By the 21st year, the mystery had hardened into legend. The story of the young couple who vanished on the highway became a cautionary tale for locals, retold in hushed voices at gas stations and diners. Strangers speculated freely about what had happened, while those who had lived through it grew quiet, their lives permanently altered by the weight of not knowing. And yet, despite the passing of decades, the families never let go completely. Even as their bodies weakened and their voices grew softer, they still returned to the highway, to the same shoulder where the car had once been found. They sat in silence, staring at the tree line, convinced that the truth was still there, buried somewhere close, just waiting for the right moment to emerge. What they didn't realize was that the land itself, silent for so long, held the answers they had been searching for. And in time, those answers would come to light in the most unexpected and chilling way. More than 20 years had passed since the couple's car was found on the shoulder of the highway, its hazard lights blinking into the night. The world had moved forward in those years. New detectives came and went, technology advanced, children were born and grew into adults. But for the families, time had stood still, anchored to that single night when two lives had disappeared into silence. The case had become a cold file buried in archives, pulled out only on anniversaries, or when a reporter needed a haunting story. No one expected it to stir again. But the land itself had other plans. The summer of the 21st year was marked by a punishing drought. Streams dried to cracked beds, ponds shrank to muddy puddles, and the ground split open under the relentless heat. Near the highway where the couple vanished, a parcel of land long left to weeds and overgrowth had been marked for potential development. A group of surveyors arrived one morning, machetes in hand, cutting their way through briars and saplings that had choked the field for decades. They expected nothing more than tangled brush and biting insects. What they found instead would unearth a secret no one had dared to imagine. As they pushed deeper into the property, one of the men noticed a shallow circular depression in the ground. At first glance, it looked like the remnants of a collapsed sinkhole, or maybe the remnants of an old storage pit. Curious, they cleared away branches and debris, revealing a crude covering of rotted wood and rusted metal scraps. The formation was too symmetrical to be natural. One of the older surveyors, familiar with the area's farming past, recognized it instantly. An old well, the kind dug by hand long before modern plumbing, then abandoned and forgotten once farms changed hands. The discovery was odd but not alarming. Rural areas were dotted with relics like this, hidden under growth and time. But when one of the surveyors knelt down and peered through a gap in the covering, what he saw made his blood run cold. Instead of dark water reflecting the sky, he saw pale stones slick with decades of dampness, and clinging to those stones was something that did not belong there. Faded strands of fabric, tangled and torn, hung like cobwebs against the rough wall. The color was muted, dulled by age, but unmistakably cloth. For a long moment he said nothing, then slowly stepped back, unable to shake the thought that he was staring at evidence of something far darker than a collapsed well. The men argued briefly about what to do, their unease mounting as they realized the depth of what they had found. One insisted it was nothing, just trash or remnants dropped long ago. Another argued that it was impossible for cloth to cling that high up on the stone unless something had been placed inside. In the end, they did the only thing they could. They called the authorities. Within hours, sheriff's deputies were on site, their arrival sparking immediate speculation among locals who watched from the roadside. When investigators confirmed that the opening did indeed appear to be a sealed well, they ordered the area cordoned off. Specialists were called in, including a forensic recovery team accustomed to working in difficult conditions. The discovery of fabric inside raised questions too serious to ignore. Memories of the couple's disappearance came rushing back into the community, the cold case suddenly alive again after more than 2 decades. The families, who had lived for years with silence, received the call they had long dreaded and long prayed for. Authorities told them only that a discovery had been made near the old highway and that it might be significant. News of the well spread quickly, reigniting interest in the case that had once gripped the area. Reporters arrived almost immediately, cameras pointed at the cordoned field while deputies stood guard. The discovery of any abandoned structure would have been notable, but the possibility that it contained remains was electrifying. For the first time in years, detectives returned to the file not just as history, but as an active investigation. As evening fell on the day of the discovery, floodlights illuminated the site while crews worked cautiously, peeling back the rotted boards covering the opening. The air that escaped from below was damp and sour, carrying with it a stench that left little doubt something had been trapped down there for years. Peering into the darkness, investigators confirmed what the surveyor had first glimpsed: strands of fabric, impossibly old, clinging to stone where no wind or water could have placed it. The shaft plunged deep, too dark to see the bottom, but the evidence near the surface already told them this was no ordinary well. For the families, the news reopened wounds that had never truly closed. They gathered in their homes, waiting by telephones for updates, torn between hope for answers and dread of confirmation. After 21 years of silence, the possibility that their children's remains had been found was almost unbearable to consider. Yet they knew that whatever lay at the bottom of that shaft, it was tied to the mystery that had stolen their lives all those years ago. Investigators prepared to begin the careful process of recovery. For them, it was not just about solving a cold case, it was about respecting the dead and preserving the evidence that might finally reveal what had happened on that highway night so long ago. Beneath the soil, beneath the silence, something had waited for decades. And as the cover of the well was fully removed, all who stood there understood the gravity of what they were about to uncover. The search for answers that had once seemed hopeless was about to resume, this time guided not by rumor or speculation, but by something tangible, something hidden in plain sight for decades. The well, once dismissed as folklore, had revealed itself at last, and inside it, investigators suspected, lay the truth that had eluded them for more than 20 years. The morning after the discovery, the overgrown lot no longer felt forgotten. Police cruisers lined the dirt access road, news vans crowded the shoulders of the highway, and a tent had been erected over the opening to shield the operation from view. Forensic specialists arrived in unmarked trucks, their gear laid out with deliberate precision. This was no ordinary recovery. Investigators already suspected what they would find, but none of them could prepare for the reality of it. The well was deeper than it first appeared. Once the covering was removed, they found the shaft plunging more than 30 feet into the ground, its stone walls slick with condensation, the bottom lost to darkness. Cables were rigged, cameras lowered, their grainy images transmitted to a monitor above. What appeared first on the screen was not water, but debris, collapsed wood, rotting leaves, and the unmistakable presence of fabric woven into the cracks of the rock. The camera shifted, and for a brief, chilling moment, the shape of bone could be seen half buried in silt. The air that rose from the well carried with it the smell of rot and decades of damp confinement. It clung to the team's clothing, making clear that whatever lay below had been there for a very long time. One by one, forensic experts descended into the shaft, working methodically, cataloging every inch. They removed sediment in layers, brushing carefully to preserve fragments that might otherwise crumble into dust. Each item pulled up was bagged, tagged, and logged. Scraps of decayed clothing, corroded metal, and then, finally, what they all knew was coming. The first bones were lifted in silence. A femur, fragile and pale, followed by ribs and vertebrae. The recovery was painstaking, each fragment passed upward by gloved hands to those waiting above. Within hours, it was clear that there was more than one set. Forensic specialists confirmed 2 separate skeletons intermingled in the silt at the bottom. Alongside the remains, items of personal belonging emerged, fragments of denim, the remnants of a leather belt, and most damning of all, a corroded wristwatch frozen in place, its band still clinging to bone. But what struck investigators most was not the presence of bones, it was what accompanied them. Among the fragments was a ring, still recognizable despite decades underground. Jewelers later confirmed it was a unique design, custom-made, a piece that relatives instantly recognized as belonging to the missing woman. Alongside it, strands of fabric were tested and found to match the shirt she had been last seen wearing. Piece by piece, the artifacts built a picture no one wanted to see but everyone had expected. The missing couple had been found. When the families received the news, the impact was devastating. For 21 years, they had lived in the limbo of not knowing, trapped between faint hope and crushing dread. Now that uncertainty was gone, replaced with the finality of death, parents who had once clung to the possibility of reunion now faced the reality that their children had been lying in darkness all along, hidden beneath the very land they had searched so many times. Siblings who had grown up telling their own children about the mystery now had to explain that the mystery was no longer about disappearance, but about murder. The recovery took days, each layer yielding more fragments until 2 complete profiles could be reconstructed. Medical examiners confirmed that both sets of remains belonged to young adults consistent with the missing couple's ages at the time of their disappearance. DNA testing, though slow, later removed any doubt, confirming their identities beyond question. For the public, the case that had haunted the community for 2 decades finally had a face again, not the smiling photographs from missing posters, but the stark, undeniable evidence of bones retrieved from a hidden grave. Yet the discovery did not bring closure. Instead, it brought new questions. How had they ended up at the bottom of an abandoned well? Had they fallen in by accident? Had they been placed there deliberately? The depth of the shaft and the presence of heavy debris suggested that someone had intentionally covered it. For investigators, this was not simply recovery. It was the opening chapter of a homicide investigation long delayed. The media swarmed to the story, broadcasting images of the site, interviewing neighbors who recalled hearing of the well in the woods for years, but never knowing if it truly existed. The legend that had once been dismissed as folklore now stood as grim reality. And in that reality, detectives understood the weight of what they had uncovered. 2 lives taken, hidden deliberately, and concealed for more than 2 decades by silence, neglect, and soil. The families were given the chance to view some of the personal effects recovered from the shaft. A necklace, badly corroded but still intact, brought one mother to tears. A father, upon seeing the rusted wristwatch, said nothing. He only lowered his head, the grief too, heavy to voice. They had always suspected their children had never made it far from the roadside. Now, standing before these relics, they knew they had been right all along. When the last of the remains were carried from the site, investigators covered the shaft once again, sealing it with reinforced concrete. The well that had served as a hidden grave for 21 years would never claim another life. But for detectives, the work was just beginning. The presence of two bodies in a sealed shaft was no accident. It was a crime, and if the evidence could be traced, even after decades, it might still reveal who had placed them there. For the families, the grief was overwhelming, but so was the demand for justice. Answers had been unearthed, but not the ones that mattered most. They now knew where their loved ones had been all this time. What they didn't know was who had put them there, or why. And those questions would carry the case into its next chapter, a desperate search to unravel how two young lives had ended at the bottom of a forgotten well. The recovery of the couple's remains brought relief in the form of answers, but those answers quickly twisted into darker truths. When forensic analysts began their examination, it became clear that what had happened was not an accident, nor the result of two people simply wandering into danger. The evidence told a very different story, one that stripped away any hope the families might have had that this tragedy had been chance. The first revelation came from the well itself. Once debris was cleared and the shaft mapped, investigators confirmed the entrance had been deliberately weighted down. Stones larger than a man could move alone had been arranged across the top, concealed under brush and wood. This was not the result of nature or erosion. Someone had sealed the opening to make sure whatever was inside remained hidden. That single fact eliminated the possibility of an accidental fall. The couple had been placed there. The bones, though weathered by decades underground, still held their own story. Forensic anthropologists detected blunt force trauma to both skulls, fractures so distinct they could not be attributed to collapse or decay. These were blows delivered with force consistent with an assault. One skull bore two separate fractures, suggesting repeated strikes. Another showed damage on the back of the head, as though the victim had been taken by surprise. The conclusion was unavoidable. The couple had been murdered. For detectives, this changed everything. What had once been handled as a disappearance was now officially a homicide case, albeit one more than 20 years cold. The shift from speculation to fact sent shockwaves through the families, who were forced to reimagine their loved ones' final moments not as confused or accidental, but as violent and deliberate. The grief that came with that realization was crushing, but so too was the demand for justice. Someone had taken their children's lives, and someone had hidden them in that well. Detectives returned to the old case files, rereading notes from interviews conducted in the days and weeks after the disappearance. Among the earliest persons of interest was a farmhand who had lived near the highway at the time. He was known to wander the area late at night and had been questioned after locals claimed to see him near the shoulder where the couple's car had been found. At the time, there had been no evidence to hold him, and he was eventually cleared. But with the confirmation of homicide, his name resurfaced in bold print on the suspect list. Investigators also revisited reports of a drifter who had passed through the region in the late 1990s, a man described as violent, prone to fights and living on the margins of society. Witnesses recalled seeing him sleeping under bridges and in abandoned barns. One resident even remembered him carrying a heavy crowbar everywhere he went. Back then, he had been considered but never directly linked to the disappearance. Now, with knowledge of blunt force trauma, his history of violence seemed far more relevant. Modern technology gave detectives tools they had not possessed 2 decades earlier. DNA analysis was run on the recovered remains, not only to confirm identity, but also to detect trace evidence that might have survived on the clothing or jewelry. Soil samples were taken from beneath the bodies, analyzed for any chemical residue that might suggest accelerants or attempts to hasten decomposition. Though the years had stripped much away, small fragments of possibility remained, each one representing a chance to link the crime to a suspect. Forensic technicians returned to the abandoned well site, expanding their search into the surrounding woods. Metal detectors swept the ground, uncovering rusted fragments that could have been part of tools or weapons. Every item was cataloged and sent for analysis, though the passage of time made definitive conclusions elusive. Still, detectives knew that every detail mattered. Even a partial fingerprint or a hair fragment could be the thread that unraveled the case. The families watched this renewed investigation with cautious hope. They had been down this road before, listening to detectives speak of breakthroughs that led nowhere. But this time felt different. This time, they had their children's remains, evidence of violence, and the undeniable fact that someone had murdered them. The need for answers grew more urgent than ever, even as the reality of decades passing made prosecution increasingly difficult. Detectives worked methodically, drawing up a new suspect board. Names once dismissed were placed back under scrutiny. Associates of the farmhand were re-interviewed, asked about his habits, his whereabouts, his temper. Old arrest records were pulled, cross-referenced with timelines. The drifter's movements were tracked through what little documentation existed. Arrest logs in neighboring counties, a trail of transients that painted him as a man capable of sudden violence and sudden disappearance. Though leads were thin, the weight of evidence from the well spoke volumes. 2 young lives had been ended by force, their bodies hidden in a place chosen for its secrecy. That pointed to intent, planning, and knowledge of the land. This was not random. Whoever had committed the crime had known the well existed, had known it was a place that could swallow evidence for decades. That detail narrowed the scope. The killer was either a local or someone who had spent enough time in the area to learn its forgotten places. For the families, the horror deepened. It was not enough to know their children had been killed. Now they had to confront the possibility that the murderer had walked among them all these years, unrecognized, unpunished, perhaps even seen at the vigils or in the grocery stores of the town. That thought brought a new kind of torment, one that left them awake at night replaying old faces and wondering who had hidden the truth in plain sight. Detectives pressed forward, knowing that momentum was fragile. With each step, the case grew heavier, more urgent. They had confirmed homicide, but the larger question remained unanswered. Who had struck the blows, and why? The answers still lay buried in time, waiting for a connection that could finally bring the killer into the light. The discovery of the remains had reclassified the case as homicide, but evidence alone wasn't enough to deliver justice. Detectives knew they needed to identify the person who had wielded the weapon, someone who had not only killed the couple, but also gone to great lengths to conceal their bodies in the well. In the aftermath of the forensic findings, a cold case task force was assembled, drawing on newer technology that had been unavailable in the late 1990s. Their job was to comb through every scrap of evidence with fresh eyes, hoping that something overlooked decades earlier might finally reveal the truth. One of the first steps was to revisit the couple's abandoned car, long since stored in police archives. Back in the early days of the investigation, technicians had dusted for prints, lifting several partial impressions from the interior door handles and dashboard. At the time, none of them matched anyone in the limited databases available. Most were smudged, incomplete, and ultimately deemed useless. But technology had advanced. Scans of those same fragments, once considered too degraded to analyze, could now be digitally enhanced, reconstructed, and compared against a far wider national database. The process was meticulous. Each latent print was rescanned, filtered, and digitally sharpened. Analysts spent hours enhancing ridges that had once appeared as nothing more than faint shadows. What emerged shocked the team. One partial fingerprint, lifted from the passenger side door, yielded a match. It belonged to a man who had lived less than 10 miles from the stretch of highway where the couple vanished. His name was already familiar to law enforcement. He had a long record of arrests for violent assaults, bar fights, and petty theft. During the very years when the couple disappeared, he had been drifting between temporary jobs, often staying on farms or in cheap motels. He was known for his temper and had once been charged with attacking a motorist during an altercation on the road, though the case had collapsed when witnesses failed to appear. At the time of the original investigation, he had been questioned briefly, but without evidence linking him to the disappearance, he had slipped through the cracks. Now, with a fingerprint tying him directly to the couple's car, detectives knew he could no longer be dismissed. They reconstructed his timeline, tracking his movements in the late 1990s. What they found was chilling. He had lived in a small rental near the woods not far from where the well was hidden. Neighbors recalled him being secretive, often coming and going late at night and disappearing for days at a time. One former employer described him as unpredictable, like a storm waiting to break. As the task force dug deeper, they uncovered a second revelation. The man had eventually left the state in the early 2000s after a string of violent incidents. His trail led to another county hundreds of miles away, where he was arrested and convicted of aggravated assault following a brutal attack on a co-worker. He was sentenced to prison, where he spent the final years of his life. Records showed he died behind bars more than a decade before the couple's remains were ever recovered. The realization was bittersweet. Detectives had found their likely killer, but he was beyond the reach of justice. The fingerprint was not circumstantial. It placed him inside the couple's car on the very night they disappeared. Combined with his history of violence, his proximity to the abandoned well, and his reputation for unpredictable rages, the pieces fit together too neatly to ignore. Yet there would be no trial, no cross-examination, no opportunity for the families to look him in the eye and demand answers. When investigators shared the findings with the families, the room was thick with conflicting emotions. There was relief in having a name, confirmation that the nightmare had not been a random accident but a crime committed by someone real. But there was also anger that the man had lived out his days without ever being held accountable, anger that they had been left in the dark for so many years while he walked free. Some family members wept, others sat in silence, and still others pressed detectives with questions that could no longer be answered. Why them? What triggered the attack? Was the robbery gone wrong or something more sinister? Those details, sealed inside the mind of a dead man, would never fully be known. The task force documented their findings carefully, releasing a public statement that, while not officially closing the case, pointed clearly to the man as the prime suspect. They detailed the fingerprint evidence, his violent record, and his history in the area at the time of the murders. The announcement brought the case back into the spotlight, drawing both sympathy and frustration from a public that had long followed the mystery. For the families, the confirmation marked a turning point. After years of imagining countless scenarios, they finally had a name to attach to their grief. Yet, closure felt hollow. The absence of a trial meant there would be no formal reckoning, no chance to see justice carried out in a courtroom. What remained was the knowledge that the truth had been buried as long as their children had been, hidden until technology finally pulled it to the surface. Detectives admitted privately that the case had taught them a painful lesson about time. Evidence that once seemed meaningless had become the key to unlocking the mystery. If the fingerprint had been matched sooner, the killer might have faced consequences in life rather than escaping them in death. That regret weighed heavily on those who had inherited the case after so many years. Still, the identification represented progress. The families could finally bury their loved ones with answers, even if those answers came too late to change the past. The abandoned well had given up its secrets, and the fingerprint had named its culprit. But what lingered in the silence was the most haunting realization of all. For 2 decades, the man who had killed them had lived among others, unseen, carrying a secret as heavy as the stones that had sealed the well. For more than 2 decades, the couple's disappearance had haunted the community, leaving a trail of unanswered questions that clawed at the edges of everyone who knew them. Every tip, every rumor, every dry stretch of road where they might have been seen had been chased, only to dissolve into dead ends. When the well was uncovered, that trail suddenly converged into something tangible, something horrifyingly clear. Forensic teams worked tirelessly, analyzing the skeletal remains, clothing remnants, and personal items, each fragment a piece of a puzzle that had remained unsolved for 21 years. The evidence told a story that was brutal but undeniable. Investigators reconstructed the likely sequence of events. On that day, in the late 1990s, the couple had probably pulled to the side of the highway due to car trouble. They had been vulnerable, isolated in a stretch of road shadowed by woods and overgrown fields. It was there that the drifter, a violent man whose movements had been fleeting but fatal, encountered them. He had robbed them, taking whatever he could carry, and when resistance was met, struck them both with fatal blows. The injuries on their skulls matched the blunt force trauma, recovered in the forensic report, a violent, deliberate act that left no room for accident or misadventure. After the attack, he disposed of their bodies in the abandoned well, layering stones atop the entry point to ensure they would not be found. For 21 years, that well had been a silent witness, hiding the truth beneath its stone cover while search parties scoured the surrounding area. The couple's absence became a haunting presence in the lives of their families, a void that stretched across birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays. The discovery finally illuminated what had been lost in shadows. The darkness had a name, and the mystery had been tangible all along. When the families received confirmation from authorities, the weight of relief and grief collided. There was sorrow in realizing the violence their loved ones had endured, but there was also a grim sense of closure. The couple could finally be laid to rest together, their remains returned to the earth with dignity after years of uncertainty. For the first time in over 2 decades, the open wound of absence began to heal. The abandoned well, once whispered about in fearful speculation and local legend, had become the marker of truth. It was no longer just a forgotten hole in the ground, but a witness to a crime long hidden, a testament to the patience of forensic investigation, and a silent monument to a family's enduring search for answers. The darkness that had once shrouded the highway was finally named, and in that naming, some semblance of peace was granted.